No, you haven't sorted your cubes yet.
Sort your cubes.
Sort your cubes.
You go over there with your other boys and sort your cubes.
Feeling.
Anders, share your cubes.
Share your cubes, Anders.
Better if I record you to lower volume and then put gain on it to maybe get that background sound out. Whatever. It's done. We're doing it. Are you ready for a podcast?
I'm ready.
Great. Then hello and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony Boromir Sucks Maddox.
It sure does. Or he sure does. Yeah, just putting those Lord of the Rings cards in your cube turns out is a mistake. Don't do it. You heard it here first.
Anthony, what context does Boromir suck?
So specifically in my Turbo Cube, where all spells and abilities cost 2 less to cast, let me actually just bring up this Boromir and take a look at what he does.
Borborgamos, Warden of the Tower.
The problem is that Boromir says, whenever your opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. And in this environment, there's a ton of cards you want to cast for free, and so obviously this card is here for a reason to try and counter the most broken sort of like storm strategies, but the fact that it's asymmetrical is just so frustrating, and I've been meaning to cut this from this cube for quite a while now, and, I had played against it last night, and I actually was able to beat this card, and I'm glad I was able to spank it on the bottom on the way out.
No. Your opponent had a kind of broken turn one that involved ending on Boromir, and everyone at the whole table was like, big groan, it's all going downhill, and then you somehow pulled out a win, which I believe involved letting a bunch of spells get countered into casting a huge galvanic relay?
Exactly, yeah. So they played Monastery Mentor, and then like 2 or 3 free spells, they had a bunch of tokens, and then it ended on Boromir, so it's just like, well, I'm kind of dead, and I look at my hand, and it was a really good hand that just suddenly did nothing. But after sort of reading the cards a couple times and being like, wait a minute, I can still cast my spells, they just get countered. So I cast Birgi, the god of storytelling, and then cast 3 or 4 free spells.
And that one you can't actually cast because it requires
1 red mana. And notably, the way the rules of Magic work, you can't just like choose to pay for mana. Like if something has a reduced cost, you can't just be like, I'm good for it, I'll pay 1. You just can't cast these cards, or rather you can, but they will get countered. So I just then cast 3 or 4 free spells. Birgi generates a red mana whenever you cast a spell, which meant that I had enough mana to, I think I then cast something else big, and then ended on a galvanic relay for like storm count as 7 or 8, and it was great.
But then, did you find a removal spell or something? Like, wouldn't all those spells you hit off Galvanic Relay mostly also get countered by Boromir?
Yes. So of those 8 cards, it was again like, okay, well, I'll play this land and then cast 3 of these free spells to get 3 more red mana, and then cast these 2 removal spells, and then, I don't know, do something.
And then turbo off.
I think I ended that game by casting Aetherflux Reservoir and then the Mirage Mirror to copy the Aetherflux Reservoir, and then barely getting through to actually casting enough spells with the double Aetherflux Reservoir to win the game. Which is pretty typical for the Turbo Cube. That's the kind of stuff that happens.
This is a very Turbo episode. We are talking about the Turbo Cube, and we're talking about how Anthony has not made updates of his cube in, what has it been, like 9 months?
Something around there, yeah. I think it was like 4 sets that I went back through.
If you hear some bouncing around in the background, my poor dog has a big cone on her head because she had a minor surgery. She's fine, but she is bumping into all the furniture and making noise.
She has to explore a whole new world.
We're painting a soundscape for you here. All the little plonks and bumps you hear in the background are just the dog bumping into furniture with the big cone. So we're talking about the updates you're making prior to CubeCon this year. Today, as we're recording, is the final day to lock in your list. So by the time you are listening to this, the lists are confirmed for the event.
So I thought it would be a great idea on the last day that we can update cubes to make, 50 changes. What could possibly go wrong? We can't playtest it after this point, but that's never led to any problems, has it?
I mean, I think you and I are pretty strongly of the opinion that all cubes are just fun, and it's actually fine, and you can just change stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
we're not overly precious about...
I'm trying to make a joke about Nadu here that you're not picking up on, but that's okay.
I did not get the Nadu joke, but also I think Nadu belongs in this cube. Hot take.
I know, you said that, and I don't agree. But yeah, I mean, I've definitely feel my attitude about editing cubes and presenting cubes at events has really, really changed the last couple of years. I mean, the first time that I had a cube at CubeCon, that was like the first time people outside of our local playgroup. I mean, honestly, if we go back even to just the first time I was introducing my cubes to the local playgroup, both those situations, I was kind of nervous. And at CubeCon, it was like, boy, if 8 people that are actually like really skilled players. Like, what if 8 LSVs sit down at this table and play my cube? On one hand, that would be interesting to see how it shook out. On the other hand, I was terrified it would just be like, yeah, this cube is totally broken. This is the one dominant strategy. Everybody's just fighting for this, and the cube sucks. But, I mean, as I've just had cubes in a couple events, I've just gotten so much less anxious about it as I've realized that, yeah, every cube is fun at least once, and people are playing it one time, so it's not like people have time to, like, really dig into it and iterate on their strategy and dive into the meta. It's sort of like everybody's playing it for the first time and exploring it, so even if I make a bunch of changes here, sure, I'm not exactly sure how it's going to play out. I'm going to be a little bit conservative about a few of them because of this.
Don't worry, Anthony. I'll tell you how it'll play out.
But it's still going to be fun for people to explore this space, even if I'm not the expert on how everything is going to work.
So that's what we're doing in this episode. We are reviewing your 50 cuts and 50 ads for the Turbo Cube leading up to CubeCon.
And I want to say, I'm interested in your feedback on this list as well. We got, let's call it 6 hours or so for me to make more changes.
I was going to say, like, are you interested in my feedback and you will put it on a Post-it note to revisit on November 1st? Or are you interested in feedback as in this is not locked in? You might change your mind between now and midnight.
Things. I think some of your suggestions I'm going to say, I'm a little too much of a coward to make that change, but some of your suggestions I might accept.
I mean, there's some bold changes in here. I think before we get too deep into the specific changes, I do want to go over this cube a little more depth than just saying there's a rules modification, because for those of you that are listening for the first time that are not familiar with this cube, it is a kind of radical recontextualization of how Magic cards function. Like Anthony mentioned, the one rules change is that all spells and abilities are reduced by 2 generic mana. And what that
say specifically activated abilities, so if something imposes a tax or like you counter unless you pay 3, you still got to pay for that. The mana cost of spells isn't changed. It's just what you're paying for casting spells, activating abilities.
Precisely. So what that means is that there are a ton of free spells in this cube and a ton of cards that have free activated abilities, primarily free cycling, which allows you to just take tons of game actions, right? It is not uncommon to cast 4, 5, or 6 spells in the first turn of the game. It's not uncommon to cycle 3 or 4 times with cards from your opening hand if you're in the right deck. You're just doing a lot of things on every single turn of the game. And the vast majority of spells that are not free are 3 mana value, 2 generic mana, and 1 pip of another color, which means they're effectively now 1-drops. So you mentioned Burgi. Burgi only costs a single red mana in this environment because the 2 generic mana is what you get the discount on. And you can imagine that a lot of 3-drops become broken by this rules change. And something you discover when you build this cube for the first time, which might be unintuitive to people listening, is that you might think that, oh, there's a 2 mana discount on all spells and abilities. Now I can play 6-drops and 7-drops and actually get to the mana to cast them. But of course, taking 2 mana off of a 6-drop is only, a 33% decrease in the mana value, whereas taking 2 mana off of a 3-drop is a 2/3 decrease in the mana value. You are making it so much cheaper relatively. So that 2 mana discount means so much more on actually cheap spells, on 3 mana spells, and some 4 mana spells that can actually kind of make the cut here.
Right, so yeah, assuming that, Wizards has done their job and designed cards such that you get 3 mana worth of value from a 3-drop and 6 from a 6-drop, it just really, it's very minor to take 2 mana off of a 6-drop, whereas turning a 3-drop into a 1-drop, it's like, wow, this is the most powerful card I've ever seen. It's like, here's Lightning Bolt, but with upside and upside. Here's...
and that's not even good in this cube.
And that's not even that good. Here's a 0 mana or a 1 mana 5/5, or things that are better than Moxen and Black Lotus.
Yeah, we got Guild Globe and Chromatic Sphere here doing absolutely stupid stuff.
And for a little bit of context, this cube started out as a little bit of a joke, and I kind of expected it would be kind of a brief thing. Maybe we'd play it a couple times, and then we'd take it apart and do something else with these cards.
And if you had your way, maybe you would have done that.
Maybe, but it turned out it was actually kind of fun. Like, it is pretty cool to be like, oh, I have this junk common from War of the Spark, this Guild Globe that nobody remembers. It's just this little trinkety artifact that filters some mana and draws a card, but actually being able to say this junk card is now better than power is a pretty fun experience to have every once in a while. So this isn't the cube that I want to play every single week, but every once in a while to have this like really radical recontextualization is kind of fun. And it's really fun for people the first time they open up a pack and look at all these cards and say, oh my god, all of these cards are busted.
We're going to put a link to this list in the show notes, obviously. This is also a great time to mention that we have a cards mentioned page for all the cards we talk about in every episode of this podcast. It's going to be especially important for this episode because we are probably not going to read the rules text of most of the cards we're going to talk about here, because we're talking about 50 cuts, 50 ads, that's 100 cards. Just reading that rules text back to back would take an entire hour. So if you don't know these cards, if you haven't heard them before, we might refer vaguely to what they do mechanically, but if you want to see the full mechanics in the full text, check out the cards mentioned page, which is also linked in the show notes wherever you're listening to this podcast. Howdy, y'all. Andy from the editing booth. I'm actually going to organize the cards mentioned page a little differently for this episode. Instead of doing it all chronologically like we usually do, based on the order in which we mention the cards in the episode, I'm actually just going to put Anthony's full list of cuts and full list of ads in color order on that page. So you can see what Anthony and I are looking at while we're having this conversation in that exact order. It might mean you have to search a little bit for a card we're talking about because it's not exactly in chronological order, but I think it's actually better because you can also see specific cards we didn't mention by name that Anthony is also cutting or adding to the cube. Any other cards we do mention, like all the cards we've talked about already up to this point, are also going to be in a separate section, ordered chronologically. So check that page out. I hope you're having a lovely day, and remember to hydrate. How do you want to cover these changes, Anthony? I have an idea, but I'm curious what your approach is here. How you want to talk about this?
So I think I want to just sort of talk about like overall approach to updating a cube and sort of like a few small goals that I have in making these changes. As we sort of mentioned, I don't feel beholden to every time a new set comes out, update a bunch of cards. You know, my goal with none of my cubes, this one may be closest of all, but it's not to play with the most powerful cards. So when they come out with a new super powerful card, it's not like, oh, my cube is suffering unless I add this quote unquote upgrade to the cube. Instead, it's like, I just want to find if any cards are actually doing something really novel or something really interesting. And so I had this sort of like backlog of cards that I was maybe thinking about adding. More I'm thinking about how does this cube actually play, and are there changes that I want to maybe enhance some strategies or reduce some other strategies? Are there individual cards that might bring entirely new strategies? So I was a little bit sort of looking at these last couple sets that I haven't updated for a while. Are there particular cards I wanted to throw in? Also, talking about some of these bigger term strategic and like structural changes. And the big structural changes are, honestly, they're not huge, but
I think one of these changes is pretty huge.
Yes.
It's one I've advocated for, but it's pretty huge.
All right, well, let's start with black cards. I want to just add a little bit more to the discard theme, bolster that a little bit, and we're going to add a couple cards that I think are a little bit scary, but I think there's reasons not to be afraid of them. I also overall, again, I'm not striving for like a perfectly flat power level or everything be perfectly balanced, but there are a number of cards that either they just end up in sideboards a little bit too much, and again, if we're going to Cube Cobra, it's fine when that happens for the first draft. Something is going to end up in sideboards, but in our local play group, it's like, yeah, I've seen that card in sideboards enough. Let's try and make some more use from that card in the cube. And then the last sort of change structurally is a pretty big change to the land section, which this is maybe the riskiest choice, but
I think for sure. I love it.
Again, I think there's at least some narratives we can apply to mitigate that risk.
Well, first of all, you can just blame Zach, professional game designer.
That's a really good narrative. Very easy.
I think that's by far the boldest and riskiest decision you're making. So I think we should start there.
Yeah, let's do it.
So one thing we've discovered in playing this cube is that you end up running, in many decks, very few actual cards with the land type. Which is to say, there are a lot of things that cycle for lands with types, like mountain cycling or swamp cycling. There are other things that do basic land cycling. There are other things that just tutor lands into your hand, your expedition maps, that kind of stuff. Which means that in the right deck, you can have 6, 7, 8 lands maybe, and then a bunch of these other ways to get them, or just a bunch of ways to just cycle cards, right? If you are cycling, if half your deck has free cycling, you're kind of playing a 20-card deck in some senses. And so 8 cards that have a 20-card deck is much closer to a reasonable land density. And for all those reasons, this cube has a decent density of lands, but we sometimes often find that they're kind of awkward. Like, there's just more of them than you actually need, and you maybe actually want to include a couple basics, so you have them for certain reasons, but you don't have room for them because you end up with enough non-basics. And here you're deciding just to cut a whole cycle of shocklands. And there are multiples in the cube, correct?
Yeah, there are currently 3 cycles, so my plan is to cut it down to 2, specifically to make room for some other lands. And I added so many shocklands because even though you tend to want very few lands, and especially very few of the card type land, I always lay out my lands and then also land cyclers and my expedition maps, whatever other things that are effectively just lands, ways to get lands for free in one pile. But for example, last night I think I played 4 lands in my deck. And
that's actually even especially low, all things considered.
Right, and I actually had all 3 Sacred Foundries, and I was really happy. I always wanted to be able to get a Sacred Foundry on turn 1 because I have, my deck is so high devotion because it's really powerful to play those 3 mana spells that I'm casting for 1 mana. It means it is dedicated. It costs red mana or it costs white mana, so I really want to be able to get my dual land. So having at least one Sacred Foundry was critical. My deck would not function without it. Having the other two was nice. But I sort of added so many shock lands just to kind of hedge against making sure you get at least the 1 or 2 or 3 that you need if you're playing a bunch of colors. So I'm a little bit scared of cutting down on some of those, but I think that maybe that's fine. We just have to make sure that people understand that do make sure you prioritize getting that first shock land because you're going to want your land cyclers to be able to find it.
I think it's okay here, partially because what you're replacing them with are going to be, I think, extremely high picks, which is going to mean that other lands, I think, are relatively going to come down a little. Like, these are the lands that are going to get picked highly, and the other lands will always go a little bit later. So it's not like you are cutting shock lands for some cycle of lands that are going to be riding the last 3 picks of every pack, thus making the shock lands even higher pick. Instead, you are adding in, per the recommendation of professional game designer Zachary Barish, and
make sure we put
my
that
endorsement of this suggestion,
co-signed.
You're adding in the, what are these even called? The original filter lands?
Block filter lands.
Yeah, so this is the cycle of lands that have no types. I mean, they type land, but no subtypes. And the only activated ability is pay a generic mana and tap them to add a 2-color combination of one of the guild combinations.
So in normal Magic, it's kind of like a signet. It just filters 1 mana into 2 mana, so you're still getting effectively 1 mana out of your land.
But they're not great in normal Magic because they don't tap for mana themselves. You play them on the first turn of the game, and you can't do anything with them. So these cards are not seen very often in Constructed for that reason. And
they're often seen and maligned in Commander precons.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are actually really curious to see that they decided to finish this cycle, because it was just 5 for the longest time, and they decided to finish this cycle in a recent Commander precon, and everyone was kind of like, why? I think there's even a Good Morning Magic video about it, or that mentions it at length, so I'll see if I can find that and put it in the show notes. But yeah, it's kind of a weird cycle that you probably have never heard of. Have you heard of Mossfire Valley or Skycloud Expanse or Sungrass Prairie? That's the cycle we're talking about. But here, they just tap for 2.
Yeah, so the 1 mana to activate it is reduced to 0, so you just tap it for 2 mana.
What if you had an Ancient Tomb, but also didn't deal damage, but also produced 2 colors of mana?
I would be a happy boy. That's not true. I love Ancient Tomb. Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a little bit of, it's a big change. It's just adding effectively a lot more power to the cube, but I think that Zach's points were twofold and pretty compelling. One is that the lands are currently not that exciting a pick, and so your spells are so overpowered, the lands don't get a commensurate boost, so it's like, I'm like, I really want that first Sacred Foundry, but I'm not excited about it.
Yeah.
So actually having lands that also are given that boost, get that turbo treatment, is overall maybe makes the narrative of the cube a little bit more compelling, that, you know, everything is powered up here. The other thing is, there are already plenty of ways to make a second mana on turn 1, so even though this is increasing the density of those effects, these aren't fetchable, so it's still, you've got to draw them, and...
Right. I think if they were fetchable, that would be maybe across the line in terms of reasonability.
So, I don't know. I would not be shocked if we play this and everybody's like, yeah, the game's now just, instead of ending on turn 1 20% of the time, now it's 80% of the time, so this just sucks. Like, we need to cut down on the power. But we could also cut down on the power and the speed of the format in other ways, so it's not like these would necessarily be the problem. It would just be the aggregate density. I did consider some other options of maybe just including half of these, but that feels a little weird, and I got to choose either ally and enemy, or maybe if I wanted to sort of give more power and make this thematic to a particular set of colors, I could say, like, okay, well, the reward for going green-white is you get this powerful land.
I knew you were going to say green-white. Of course you said green-white.
I'm going to say green-white. I mean, green-white is the most difficult color pair here, potentially.
I don't agree.
Okay, we can get into that later. But, so yeah, I mean, I'm still open to some of those changes. But again, it's like everybody's going to be playing this for the first time, and we're going to see how it goes.
The thing I'm really curious to see is I think these draw direct comparisons to the 5 eggs, which is not a full cycle, but there are just the allied colored eggs, like dark water egg is one of them, right? And other ones that will be in the list if you look at it in the show notes. And those are artifacts that basically do the same thing as these lands on a one-off basis and also draw a card. So in this cube, you just play them for free. They make 2 mana of 2 specific colors and draw you a card when you sacrifice them, which is very, very strong, right? These are the cards that have been like the hallmark power of this cube for a long time. And those eggs you'll take and play pretty much in any deck, right? Like, even if you maybe aren't sure you can use that mana, like I decided not to play a fully off-color egg in my deck last night, and it was very contentious to do that. Still, I think people think it was the wrong decision. I stand by it, but you'll play those in any color deck. What I'm really curious to see about these lands is how good is the red-white dual land in your green-black deck?
Yeah, that actually brings up a really important
probably
point.
Not great.
Because you have, again, that like all your spells are such high devotion, if you're playing, the red-white one, if you can't use exactly the red and white mana, which maybe you can't, then it effectively is not better than just a plains or a mountain. So, yeah, I mean, it might actually just be really incentivizing players to focus a little bit more. And again, like, I think that pairs with the making lands exciting. These cards are powerful, but they really incentivize you to be able to use all that mana. So if I take these highly, that's going to direct me into a particular color pair in the same way that a powerful card in those colors would. So I think overall that does make a lot of sense to me.
Well, that wasn't necessarily going to be my conclusion.
Okay. Your conclusion is actually 5 color is great now because you just draft a bunch of these.
That is what I was maybe thinking.
That might happen.
You're already incentivized. I mean, 5 color decks definitely work here because there's a lot of colorless cards you can pad your deck out with. So it's not like you have to draft just a bunch of playable cards that are all cohesive to one strategy in all 5 colors. You can pad your deck out with colorless spells and free cycling spells. You can just, cycle through your deck, make your deck effectively smaller. But also, you do then get to maximize those eggs that you get, right? And again, you're going to play them in most every deck, but getting to actually use the mana of those different colors means that your deck is going to be optimizing the power level of those really powerful cards. So like I said, I'm very much for this change. I think if it turns out to be something you don't like, that would be the reason, if anything.
I definitely agree. So I have another question about 5 color decks, which maybe we should save for a future episode with Jen, who I know has some strong opinions about this, but I've been playing more 5 color decks or just many color decks in general in cubes over the last couple months, and it does almost feel like there's a point where it's like, yeah, I can kind of just put in like a pile of basics, and even though it feels like, oh, I'm never gonna have the right colors, it's like, I'm gonna have some colors, and if I have 5 colors of cards, there's going to be something I can do with that. Like, it's going to line up in some way. I don't know how to...
Citation needed on this one.
I haven't said this theory out loud yet, but that's why we're going to come back to it.
I think I hear what you're saying. It's a pretty complicated math. Like Frank Carson has done if you want to cast X card reliably by turn 3, here's the number of sources you need math. But he has not done the math of, okay, let's say my deck has 2 colored 3 drops of every 2 color combination.
It's like,
and a bunch of random
which
fixing
one
lands.
I cast, as long as I can cast one of them.
We have been trying to get Jen on to talk about 5 color good stuff. I want to save all of my thoughts for that episode because I think it's going to be a good conversation. So, different episode, but we'll flesh out that idea that...
Yeah, maybe I can do some...
If I have lands and cards, I'll be able to cast something.
All right, speaking of 5 color good stuff, we've also talked a little bit about... I have a card in here called Cave of Temptation, which is, again, it's a filter land, but it just filters colorless into any color, which... Again, in this format just means it's a land that taps for any color. Turns out they've made a whole bunch of variations on this kind of card over the last year that just have like different kind of like minor trinket text. These include Hidden Grotto, Hall of Tagsin, the Mycosynth Gardens, and I was thinking of throwing a bunch more of those in as well, mostly just
Tarnation Vista.
Tarnation Vista, that's another... There's more than I even wanted to add, but now you're kind of scaring me into thinking maybe these are not such a good idea.
I don't know.
Like, I like having
what do I know?
I like having just one of them in the list just to demonstrate, like, here are the kinds of things that can happen in the Turbo Cube, but maybe just a bunch of 5 color lands is not a great idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I think one specifically, well, I don't know. I have no idea. I think Tarnation Vista is a very cool one.
I think the Mycosynth Gardens has to be the most interesting.
That one definitely has a high upside.
Another minor land change that you actually suggested as well is throwing in 1 green bounce land. So this also taps for 2 mana, but when it enters, you have to return a land to your hand. So this is much more fair, but also much more popular in other kinds of cubes. This would not be because it's a great land on its own, but because it could be potentially part of a lot of combos with Fast Bond, or you want to, Fast Bond and get a bunch of landfall triggers, things like that. I think some decks might want this.
There's a lot of play multiple lands per turn effects, not just Fast Bond. That's the premier one, but there's also Azusa and Wayward Swordtooth and Summer Bloom and others, Oracle of Moldiah. So, yeah, I think the 1 bounce land is going to be really sick here, honestly, and a sweet payoff for that landfall deck that it's really going to turn it up to 11.
I was going to say also that this is also like a pretty low-risk ad because, what's the worst that could happen? But actually...
Turn 1 Fast Bond combos?
Fast Bond combos.
The worst that can happen is...
do a lot.
Oh, my opening hand is Bounce Land, Fast Bond, Tireless Tracker.
Uh-huh.
GG's.
Ring of Vulcus, give it haste.
No, you don't even need to do just draw your deck.
Just let me play Ring of Vulcus.
Just draw your deck and do anything. You don't have to kill with Ring of Vulcus.
Well, you draw the Ring of Vulcus in the process of drawing your deck. All right, should we jump over to some black cards?
Yeah, let's jump over to that other sort of high-level theme you mentioned. And this is a deck that I played last night, and also I think have had probably the biggest... I've just dumped suggestions for this deck on you because I'm kind of obsessed with it, and I think I've played it more than anybody at this point, and I want it to be good so bad.
Yeah, and I think the sort of kernel for it is a lot of decks are kind of doing stormy things, but I still want different colors and different color pairs to have somewhat sort of thematic feeling strategies. So, for example, green is very much storming off, but you're playing Summer Bloom and Fast Bond and playing a bunch of lands and drawing a bunch of cards with your Tireless Tracker.
Or Jade Mage and Skull Clamp.
Jade Mage and Skull Clamp. We all enjoy a good Jade Mage. Because so many people are already discarding things, there's so many different cycling effects and other ways to just filter through your deck. You had suggested adding Megrim, which is an enchantment that punishes players, deals damage whenever they discard cards, and then just upping a little bit of the discard package. So I already had a lot of these Mind Rot effects, so they're 2 and a black for your opponent discards 2 cards with a lot of different variation. And again, I want to sort of showcase the variety of here we can make the most powerful Mind Rot ever, and here we can make Thoughtseize, but even better by adjusting these cards' mana value. And when we already have that, then adding a few of these enchantments to sort of power it up, or make it not just a disruptive element, but actually a strategic element, where your whole deck is about trying to get your opponent to discard a bunch of cards for value. That's an interesting idea for what black can do.
Yeah, and where that came from is we were talking about hate bears, and there's a lot of them in white, some of them in red, some of them in green, and we were kind of lamenting the fact that there's not really a lot of hate bears that punish cycling, which is one of the most degenerate things you can do here, is just have a deck with 15 free cyclers and then some combo you can just always cycle towards, or just trade routes, and then all your lands are free cyclers and you just kind of go off. So the idea to include things like Megrim and Waste Not and things like that was just, this is effectively a hate bear for the cycling strategy. So you don't necessarily even have to be playing a deck that has a ton of ways to make your opponent discard for these cards to be pretty good. Like, Waste Not, I think, is main deckable in this environment if you have almost no discard at all in your entire deck. I mean, you're going to have some if you're in black just because it's such a big theme, but you don't have to be playing a discard deck to make Waste Not really good. It just makes all of your opponent's cycling decisions really difficult and give you a lot of upside.
Yeah. So I think I'm adding at least 3 more Mind Rot effects, which I don't know if we want to get into the details of them, as well as adding an Unearth, just because, I don't know, maybe that's not really tied to this, but yeah, I'm curious how that goes.
That was another suggestion of mine, is the Unearth, actually, which I love here. I think you may have overlooked it just because it only costs 1 mana. I know that a lot of times when you're searching Scryfall for cool cards for this cube, you're like, well, I got to find the stuff that I'm getting a discount on. And I'm not even getting a discount on
Where's the 3
Unearth?
mana Unearth that does more?
But giving it free cycling here, I mean, you have intentionally kept the cards with free cycling to just ones that are also cool to cast.
Yeah, and I've cut down on them over time as well.
For a while, I think you had a bunch of them, and it was like, all right, well, these cards don't even really have any text. Like, you were only ever just cycling these. But because 3-drops are so good here, for all the reasons we've talked about, Unearth getting back your Chrome Host Seed Shark, your Monastery Mentor, your Psy Maverick Thopterist, your Tireless Tracker, these are all premier threats in this cube. So this still has 1 mana to get back all of your best threats, and then free cycling on top of it, so I think it fits really nicely here.
Yeah, so I'm also considering 2 cards that basically are creatures that turn into dark rituals. This is Priest of Gix and Overeager Apprentice. Priest of Gix, for example, it's effectively 1 mana here. When it enters the battlefield, it'll make black. And I think that my hope here is that one of the challenges is a lot of the payoffs for the discard, the Megrims and, especially the Fell Spectre, and there's a couple others, cost more than 1 mana, so it's a little bit difficult to get in play, or you really want to be able to cast your Waste Not and then be able to use a discard in the same turn to really
That's
get
what I was going to say.
Turbo start.
Yeah,
and
having played this deck a bunch, the thing that is most difficult is that I think you can have a deck in this cube that does not just dump its whole hand on turn 1 and go super fast. I think that is currently the premier thing to be doing, and if you're not doing it, you're probably not favored, but it's possible to have a viable deck that does that. If your deck is doing that, though, you're basically got to be like a reactive deck. You have to have control elements, and so I have to start on a turn 1 discard spell if I am not going to start on dumping my whole hand, because if I don't, my opponent is going to dump their whole hand. But very often, taking 1 key card out of it can totally disrupt their entire plan, right? Like, you take the Monastery Mentor, great, now cycle all away your free artifact trinkets, you're not making a prowess monk every single time, your hand kind of falls apart a little bit. And not being able to deploy a Megrim, a Waste Not, something alongside the discard spell on turn 1, I think has been the biggest barrier to this deck start. So I was going to say that I think of all the cards you have included here, some of which are quite good, Priest of Gix and Overeager Apprentice are by far the best ones for this specific deck. And they don't have anything to do with this card. It's just that they make 3 black mana on turn 1, and what else are you doing with black mana in this environment on turn 1?
Yeah, and I think it's exactly the same thing as the lands. It's like it sounds scary to put Dark Ritual in this cube, but it's not necessarily going to encourage the most degenerate decks. It's like you have to be focused.
You can't go Burgie into Paradoxical Outcome with Dark Ritual.
Exactly. So you're going to have to stay focused. And then I think the fact that these are attached to creatures also just makes them a lot more interesting for green-black decks that care about creatures. And then I'm also thinking about adding Warren Soul Trader and Ruthless Knave, which let you turn your creatures into treasures, which I think overall that sort of package feels kind of interesting. If anything, Warren Soul Trader might be the card I'm most concerned about of all these editions.
Oh, I think there's one card here that I'm most concerned about.
Okay, great.
It's another one I've advocated for, and it's not the lands that I think is going to be the biggest problem.
Is it Scopeth Lord?
No.
Great.
I do think Warren Soul Trader and Ruthless Knave are going to be very, very, very good, and they are going to be a slightly different deck that can or cannot overlap with the discard deck. But my deck last night would have loved these cards. I was playing kind of a combination green-black discard plus creature mid-range deck that had some sacrifice synergies, so I would have loved either of those cards for my deck for sure.
I think it's worth pointing out Withering Torment. This isn't strictly in the space, but it's basically just 2 and a black murder, which, murder's not very good in this environment when you actually have to pay double black for it, but this is going to be a solid include over some more fiddly removal spells. And I think it's worth pointing out just that, I think especially as our local play group has played this cube more, having 1 or 2, maybe 3 removal spells in your deck is really important, because your opponent's going to play that hate bear like Boromir that you just cannot win the game through.
Well, not that one anymore.
Not that one anymore, but there are plenty more that still... Your opponent can just dump their hand and then end on this hate bear. And I think increasingly people are just like my deck last night, I was playing a combo deck, a storm deck with also a combo win condition, but I still played Archon of Emeria because if I can dump my hand and just play this, I can and did win some games basically for free off of it.
Even if it's not hitting a hate bear, there are so many good payoffs that, again, are like the same way it's so good to discard that Monastery Mentor on turn 1. It's really good to also have the Dismember up when they play it on turn 1, and you can just kill that thing before it gets out of control. So I agree that this is not an environment where you're just playing dueling solitaire and seeing whose deck is the better thing. It does matter.
Sometimes it is that.
It's not as much as I think maybe some people suspect. Being able to meaningfully interact is something I want all of my decks to have in some capacity.
So 2 other cards here that aren't directly tied to those themes are Scopec Lord. This is a card that sees a home already in a lot of artifact themes cube, but it basically pumps up all your artifact creatures. Artifacts are really good here because a lot of them are free, so I think this is a pretty easy include that's going to be really strong and maybe push people in more specifically caring about artifacts, not just because they are free spells. And then Iridescent Vine Lasher, which is a creature that also has offspring, so it can make a little baby of itself. And Landfall, deal the damage to target opponent. I think that especially in the deck that you were playing last night, I was thinking about this and this is a way to actually turn your fast spawn stuff into a real win condition.
Yeah, that's much better than Ring of Valkus on my Tireless Tracker.
Look, I'm going to stick to the classics and put Ring of Valkus on my Tireless Tracker.
I really like all of these ads. There's a couple that I think are maybe less exciting, like Nocturnal Hunger. Sure, I suppose, but it's just kind of a role player. I'm more perturbed by the absence of one card for this package, which is Shoulder the Apocalypse.
Here's the thing that pushes me over the line is she has 5 toughness, and that's so hard to deal with.
You already have, isn't Sai a 1/5?
He's a 1/4.
What is Urza?
He's also a 1/4, right?
How many things do you have that actually deal 4 damage and not 5?
A lot. Don't worry about it. I think that
you think
Shielded
it
would be really punishing, and it would just be like I think players would just feel like they're locked out of the game, and it's not like their opponent's doing something cool. It's just like, well, I don't have a removal spell that can deal with that, and if I try to draw into my removal spell, I'm just gonna die, and I'm probably just gonna die getting attacked by it. So I'm not excited about that card here. Maybe that's gonna go on the maybe test after CubeCon list.
I hear that concern. I think it is incredibly fair in this environment. It is also entirely possible, if your deck is not a cycling deck, to just go over the top of Shouldred. A turn means so much more in this cube. Why this card is so punishing and constructed is that it just if the game goes long, like 6 more turns, you're just going to die. Like, it just kills you. The game never goes 6 more turns in this
But
cube
I draw
ever.
6 more cards.
Okay, so your deck gets punished by it, maybe. But, like, if someone played this against me last night, great. A+. Sounds good. Enjoy your 4 mana / 2 mana. Effectively do very little against me. I think it punishes the right decks and is a lot more beatable than you maybe think it is. Especially, like, I think it's worse than Warren Soul Trader and Ruthless Knave, for sure.
I don't know about that.
Anyway, just want it on the record that I think that would be a great little cherry on top of this discard theme and a reason to go into it, right? Like, I think it's good to have signals for decks, and that would be one that would make me really want to then prioritize wheels and prioritize discard spells instead of just... I think not everyone knows that Waste Not can be really, really strong, and I take that card very highly, but I keep getting it kind of late, which makes me think people don't respect it.
But that's the thing, is like, Waste Not is very cool. If you play your Shieldred and your Waste Not, and then you cast Wheel of Fortune, you don't get to do the cool thing with Waste Not. Your opponent is just dead.
Yeah, but that's what you want.
that's
the
cool.
goal. Shieldred, I think, is a drippingly cool card, whether you acknowledge it or not. Way cooler than Nocturnal Hunger or whatever. That's fine. But Cerebral Confiscation, fine. Not cool. You know what's cool? Shieldred. Shieldred's cool.
Look at the sick Samgway flower art. It's great.
Anyway, I just want it on the record. I think that card would be a great fit here, and I expect you to come around on it sometime. That's my theory.
We'll see.
If you want people to prioritize removal, I mean, put Shieldred in here.
And it may be just worth mentioning again, like, the cards that I'm cutting here from black are just things that aren't really doing too much. Like, Doomfall hasn't really done that much. Egon is just a 6/6 for 1 that sounds cool. And
It's not.
there still are some 6/6 for 1s or those types of cards, but I think there needs to be enough to be like, hey, isn't this a funny thing? And this one's got so much extra text, it's kind of not really worth it. Woe Strider is a card that I think is neat, but it just doesn't do enough.
Yeah, I mean, you said that you aren't, like, power maxing this cube, and it's true that you don't play every single card that's really powerful, but almost all of these changes are power upgrades. There's, like, one card you are cutting because it is maybe too strong. Everything else feels like this is a
Boromir,
card
right.
that you think is underperforming. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate.
There's one other card I think here that is also quite strong that I'm curious about why you're cutting. Let's just talk about it now. Why Reckoner Bankbuster?
You know, I was just like, I need one more cut, and I'm like, this card is fine. I'm always taking it very hardly. I'm always putting it in my deck, but it's just one of the most complicated iterations of this type of card that there are already
that's true.
3 or 4 copies of. So it's not a power level cut. It's purely just like, yeah, I mean, after playing this cube last night and looking at the cards I was thinking about adding, I was definitely feeling the fact that maybe it's worth cutting down on the complexity a little bit, because games can go long, it can be a little bit of a slog, and I really don't necessarily want this cube to be about these super complicated cards so much as transforming Guild Globes into power.
Yeah, but I would say aside from Boromir or Reckoner Bankbuster, this entire cut pile is like a list of things I would expect to ride sideboards in most every draft. So
yeah, that's true.
So
Except
even though
people still play Step Through, I don't know, maybe Wizard Cycling is cool enough to get a pass.
is Step Through on the cut list? Ooh, don't tell Allison. Allison's going to be mad about that.
I will not.
Wizard Cycling is very cool. Yeah. So, I mean, this is definitely, I think, your most power-motivated cube, or, like, power-focused cube. Like, you are trying to play the things that are interestingly more powerful in this context.
Yes.
It means that you don't just put in every signet. There's no signets, for example, because that's just, okay, you made much more mana, cool. But you are playing the cards that are powerful and interesting.
For sure. Let's actually talk about one more black card, which is Mayhem Devil. You have to really want to be able to play a 2-color or 2-pip card in this cube, but there's so much
Another one
sacrificing.
of my recommendations.
I think that this is a much more interesting payoff compared to Shieldred to punish the really greedy decks that are trying to do so much rude stuff.
I don't think it punishes them anywhere near as much. This you have to build around. There are not that many eggs. There's like, I don't know, 10 artifacts you sacrifice for value in the entire cube.
We'll find out.
Maybe 12. Like, people are sacrificing stuff here. It will come up, but I think you have to build around this. And it's cool to build around because there are a lot of self-sacrifice things going on, but I do not see that as like a Punisher card in the same way that I see Shieldred as a like really good hate bear, basically.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about green then. I think, like you said, with black, the cuts here are just like, these are cards that don't really perform, and we're making some sort of lateral swaps. Vizier of the Menagerie, cool dream, but it's, again, not worth paying 2 mana when you're trying to really focus on, like, doing land stuff, which has turned out to be the really fun, interesting thing to do here. Hooting Mandrills, just a big guy. Holistic Wisdom is the one card I was like, I kind of want to see somebody try and do something with this. I
double
added it
green
kind of
is so
speculatively,
hard.
but yeah, that is difficult. So it's just a card that lets you like swap cards between your hand and your graveyard, and I feel like that could do something cool, but...
I mean, theoretically, what it could do is, like, every artifact you draw is now just an egg, and you can reuse the same egg over and over again, but the double green and the fact that that card itself does nothing except for enable other cards, like... Cards is often your bottleneck here.
Yeah.
Like, for all of the free cycling we've talked about and all of the eggs that are just churning you through your deck, there's not a lot of card-positive things. Like, Maze Mind Tome is a great card here. Sunset Pyramid is a great card here because they just draw you one extra card a turn. They're slow. Like, it draws you an extra card a turn, and again, turns mean a lot here, so it really just kind of replaces itself the first turn, and then you have to wait for a whole turn for it to be even up one card. But they're great. I found them to be really, really good here because... it's hard to get actual card advantage in this environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that being card advantage negative, I think, is the other thing about it. Double green and card advantage negative is rough.
Right, for sure. So, leaning into that land stuff that has been fun, we got Tireless Provisioner, Bristly Bill, Spring, Heart, and Tuco. These all give you either mana or +1/+1 counters or creature tokens on landfall, respectively, and I think that these are going to just be much better support for doing the thing that people are enjoying. I guess maybe we can even put 6 into that same category as the thing that gives all your permanents in your graveyard retrace. So if you're playing a land-heavy deck, just means you do get to make up some of that card advantage, potentially.
Now we've arrived at the card that I think is the most concerning, which is
Stocking
6.
the Pantry?
No, it is 6. I think 6 is the most likely to be degenerate here because it just turns every land into an egg, and that egg is going to draw you more lands, and then you can just keep doing more egg stuff.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
It's like the really good Holistic Wisdom. Like, Holistic Wisdom, you have to have a good card to throw away. Here, if you can draw a bunch of cards, you so often end up with extra lands, and now you just turn all those extra lands into whatever the best cycling, trinkety artifact you have in your graveyard is. I just think there's a lot of things you can combine this with that, because of the ability to churn through your deck, you often end up with extra lands in hand. Like I said, I advocated for and stand by this inclusion. I think this is a card that is really interestingly good here, but I think it's the new best card in green. I think it's better than Tireless Tracker. I wouldn't be surprised if on the other side of CubeCon people were just like, that felt unbeatable.
Okay, I'm going to think about some more of the...
put it in. I'm not trying to talk you out of it.
You're scaring me.
That's my thought.
Okay, well, let's talk about how powerful Stocking the Pantry is.
Not that powerful, but I want it to be good.
This card pays you off for getting a bunch of +1/+1 counters. I think it doesn't need a ton of support. And I love playing Mana Gorger Hydra, so I just want to be rewarded by saying, here's this cute squirrel buddy that's going to help my Mana Gorger Hydra.
I recognize some of these cards, too. I think I've suggested some of these in the past. Tireless Provisioner, I think, is going to be fantastic. It's not as good as Tireless Tracker, but it is still very, very good in this context. Like I said, 6 may be broken, but very cool. And Spring Heart 9 Tuco is a thing that I've wanted from so many of my decks in this space, which is for landfall to make creature tokens. That's all I want. Now here, you may pay.
This is definitely one of those cards that I'm like, I wish half this text wasn't here, but...
If you didn't create tokens... So you can just ignore, because you don't get a discount on that you may pay 1 in a green, right? Because that's not an activated ability.
Oh, no, you're right. That is a triggered ability with a cost. Oh, we can't play this card.
Yeah.
Shoot.
I mean, you shouldn't ever really do that anyway, for the most part, I don't think. Like, you just want to get the 1/1.
Bestow is casting the card, right?
Bestow is casting, so you do get a discount on the Bestow cost.
It's so easy to miss that. So that's one of the things I've tried to do in this cube, is because it is confusing that triggered abilities with a cost don't get a discount. And there's some reasons I don't want to do that, because it would impact some other cards in weird ways. But...
Make Drakehaven too cool?
Yeah, so people have gotten really frustrated and confused by that, for good reason. All right, well, if I do decide to add this, I'm definitely going to Sharpie a big reminder on it, but...
If you're concerned about that, which is totally justifiable, I'm not sure how worth it is, to be honest. Like, it's really cool to get... Is there nothing else? No, some, like, dinky little 3-mana enchantment?
There's the 5-mana
landfall
guy.
There's Zendikar's Royal is landfall, make a token, right?
I looked and didn't find anything else that fit the bill, but I could double look.
Double look.
All right, so that's green. I'm happy where that's going.
I think the most exciting inclusions here are 6 and Simic Growth Chamber.
I love that. I mean, Simic Growth Chamber is one of my favorite cards to play.
I knew you'd jump at the opportunity to play a bounce land.
All right, so some of these other colors, I think these are kind of some more minor changes. Coruscation Mage is a card that rewards you for casting non-creature spells by dealing damage to your opponent. This is similar to a number of effects already there, so it's just kind of bolstering something that is already happening.
Now, I see Coruscation Mage and Iridescent Vine Lasher in here. Are you confused people will not understand how the discount works with Offspring?
Yes.
Is that similar to the triggered ability thing?
There are other additional costs, and that is noted on my reminder card.
Okay. Because to be clear, you get one discount on the combined cost of the casting cost and the Offspring. So
you're worried that people are going... It's not an issue actually with the Vine Lasher.
That's true. Vine Lasher, you just get the free Offspring. But with this one, you do have to pay 1 in a red in order to get the Offspring Coruscation Mage.
I think that's worth thinking about. I'm not super worried about it, but I will bear that in mind.
I think you were worried about Molten Gatekeeper being too good, but I see you decided to add it.
Yeah, so this is a 1 mana 2/3 golem, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this is similar to, some of these cards that are just like deal a little bit of damage whenever you do a thing. But I think the thing that you can do here, which is making a creature, is much easier to do. Like, there's ways to just spit out a ton of tokens. So I think this card's going to be very good, but I don't think it's going to be good in a problematic way. It just is going to represent a lot of damage. It also has Unearth, which is kind of cool that you can buy it back.
So some little ticky-tacky upgrades to red here. What are the cuts in red? Let me see. It looks like you cut a lot of the very fair stuff in red.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, just playing your Handweaver Garrison, your Legion War Boss, these end up in decks because people need playables, but they just don't do a whole lot.
The 2 cards I might miss here are Ardent Electromancer, which is in that same vein as a Priest of Gix. I will say it's in a color that is much more likely to do something degenerate and broken with that mana when you play it, so maybe that's one of the reasons it's in this pile.
It's also surprisingly hard to get a party, and the party text is a little bit confusing to people, and it's no, it's just fine on its own, because it is itself a wizard, but it's not... Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of in this, not exciting space, I guess.
Totally understand that. I also have found Rampaging Ferocidon to be quite good in some decks.
Okay, I haven't seen people play it so much. I mean, it even came up last night. Somebody was asking, does this do anything?
Yeah, I play this in my red decks, especially my Hateberry ones. The players can't gain life. It just turns off Aetherflux Reservoir and
really
some
important.
other powerful things are going on in this cube. And then the combination of being totally fine, a 1 mana 3/3 menace is fine, which is funny to say, but in this environment, that's a fine thing to play.
Yeah, 1 mana 3/3 menace,
I mean, again, I think fair decks can succeed here, and they succeed because they have cards that are fine. That puts enough pressure on in this cube to be worth it. But then sometimes, if your opponent is trying to do Chatterstorm nonsense, or is trying to, make a bunch of tokens with Jade Mage, or is trying to go off with Monastery Mentor,
play a Retrofitter Foundry,
it just makes all of that stuff hurt so much that it becomes a real problem. So that's a card I would maybe miss a bit from this pile. I don't think it's one of the premier cards in red, but I think it does a lot more than Hammer Garrison, Captain Ripley Vance, Legion War Boss. I see you're cutting a lot of a sorcery speed removal. That's also will not be missed. It's just so hard to not be able to interact at instant speed here. By the time your opponent has had a whole turn with their creature, the damage is mostly done. So those things I will not miss at all. Rampaging Ferocidon, I think, does have a place if you care.
I'll put a sticky note on that while I'm noodling on this list a little bit more. The one card I think is kind of funny here is Captain Ripley Vance, which really sort of tells you to do something specific. It's cast your 3rd spell and you get a big bonus.
Not that big of a bonus.
It's funny how people... I see this is one of the cards that people who are playing this cube for the first time kind of latch onto. So I have mixed feelings about cutting it, because it's I do kind of want that to be an on-ramp where somebody says, yes, I'm going to cast lots of spells. But the fact that it just isn't very good.
Yeah, the payoff is then you deal 4 damage to something.
And it's
cool.
Wow, your 1 mana 4/3 that killed your opponent's creature. Turns out that's kind of not... It's kind of whelming.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, it is that under the best circumstances.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just top deck it, and you're like, okay, great, now I just have a 3/2 that does nothing because I top deck this late game. Whereas, Ferocidon still has a lot of text in the right matchup late game.
All right, blue and white are making the smallest changes. I actually made my list of here's the cards I'd be happy to cut, and I think you had this experience with your cube after taking a break from updates for a couple months. After you take a step away from editing a cube, it's really easy to then just be like, oh yeah, I could cut 100 of these cards and it'd be fine. But I ended up just keeping a lot of the white cards, making fewer cuts just in the interest of color balance, which is, to be fair, still going to be pretty unbalanced after this, but that's fine. I am adding 2 white cards which I'm pretty excited about. Armed with Proof, which we could cut out a lot of this text and say it's white divination, but in the rare case that you actually make 2 clues, and then clues you control are equipment, they basically turn into Bone Splitters and give your creatures +2 power. That could be fun. 1 mana +4 power.
Yeah, I think Armed with Proof is really cool here. I don't think it's super powerful, but I want to see someone go off with it. And it's worth noting that the 1 mana divination, of which we've played a bunch in this cube in the past, and they've all been fine. Like I
don't know. I think card advantage is really important. Like
they've all been fine. That's what I'm saying. Like just
Sure,
fine.
yeah.
Like I'm never like thrilled to get a Read the Bones, but I'm always putting Read the Bones in my deck because it always draws me more cards. It replaces itself and more. But this one specifically, doing it by making artifact tokens and sacrificing them has so much inherent synergy with the cube. There's so many things that care about artifacts being in play, that care about number of game pieces, that care about sacrificing things. It is very on theme. And yeah, the world where you can combine this with like a tireless tracker, and then you just all of a sudden are like, yeah, I'll make 6 clue tokens, and then before I sacrifice them to draw cards, I will first put them all on tireless tracker and attack you for 40. Like that will just happen sometimes.
You'll love to see it. This card I think is going to be really strong. Alltech Matterweaver. This is from the set symbol that looks like the Star Trek Enterprise from the top.
Yep.
I don't know what that is.
Impossible to say what it is. It's actually unknown.
It's a 1 mana 2/4 in this context, and whenever you cast a creature spell, you either make a 1/1 colorless gnome or create a token that's a copy of an artifact token you control. I think the second one doesn't matter that much, but this is just going to spit out a whole bunch of little guys.
The second one is a really cool dream to live because it could matter, and that could be cool.
It could. I mean, it could make more clues.
What happens if you turn a servo token with Saheeli into a copy of a really good artifact and then copy it with Alltech Matterweaver?
Great question.
I'll get Judge Bones to write it, and I can use the stinger again.
While you're bothering Judge Bones.
Do you have another question for Judge Bones?
Yeah, if your Mirage Mirror becomes a copy of 3 bowls of porridge, and then you activate one of the abilities, and then later you turn it into porridge again, does it remember what it had done when it was porridge in the past?
Judge Bones, I'm sure, will be happy to weigh in on these things. Bless Judge Bones.
We read some cards, but we got confused. How do they work? We don't know. Oh, we're in trouble and there's only one person we can call. Judge Bones!
Who?
Judge Bones!
All rise for the Honorable Judge Bones.
Hello. Just like the stack, I'm going to answer your questions in reverse. First, regarding 3 bowls of porridge in Mirage Mirror, every time the Become a Copy ability resolves, it will become the object it's copying with no memory of its former activations, or the activations of the object it's copying. So yes, this means you could copy 3 bowls of porridge every turn, and use the deal 2 damage mode every turn just fine. I had to reach out to Judge Rob to double check this one, so everybody say, thanks Judge Rob. Secondly, if Saheeli makes your servo token a copy of Monastery Mentor, for example, and then you cast a creature spell, you can make a copy of the servo copying Monastery Mentor, which will result in another artifact token, Monastery Mentor. Now for this one, I want to do a short PSA. Every set, Wizards has release notes which include a bunch of card-specific rulings for situations like these, and those notes are added together, and then Scryfall. In this instance, the 4th ruling on Alltech Matterweaver on Scryfall is, if the copy token is copying something else, then the new token enters the battlefield as whatever that token copied. I love answering rules questions, but I want to make sure the public is aware that this resource exists, and in many cases your question is already answered on a website you should have open on your phone 24/7. There's also no shame in misunderstanding a complex rule like this one, Anthony. I myself wasn't clear on making copies of copies until a few years ago. This is a complicated game and we're all learning new stuff all the time. Except for Andy. Anytime he says something wrong, it's for engagement.
All right, over here, actually, the other thing I'll say about Alltech Matterweaver, probably the most powerful thing to do with it is get a treasure in play and then start making copies of that one treasure, and then you can probably just really go off and chain a bunch of creatures together.
Yeah, it is kind of funny that it triggers on creature spells. We don't see things that trigger on casting creature spells that much, and I think it is one of the harder types of spells to chain a bunch together because, if you're just chained together artifact spells, a lot of artifact spells draw more cards here, so you can naturally just keep doing that, and a lot of them are also naturally free. Not as many naturally free creatures here, and I don't think any naturally free creatures that also replace themselves. There's a lot of cantripping creatures that cost a mana. There's a fair number of free creatures, but I don't think there's any overlap to that Venn diagram.
Yeah, not that I can think of.
So it'll be interesting to see how good that actually is. I'm not sure how good this card actually is because it cares about creature spells. I also wonder how often people are going to misread this because of those 2 details. The fact that normally a card like this would care about non-creature spells, I think, historically, and also create a token if it's a copy of an artifact token is so easy, I think, to misread as token of an artifact. We'll see.
We'll find out. In blue, 2 other small changes. Tameo meets the Story Circle. This is a saga that lets you discard a bunch of cards and investigate. This has actually already been in the cube for a bit.
Double investigate.
Double investigate. I don't know. I haven't seen it in play yet. I feel like it's a little bit slow, but...
Well, this is a card that I think the Philly group who built their own budget grassroots turbo cube, the unsleeved Skookle turbo cube, This one's included in there, and I think has been a storied performer in that environment, which, to be fair, has the same rules restriction, but I think a fairly different card pool.
Yeah.
But as we mentioned, card advantage hard to come by here, and the second chapter of this just says, turn any of your cards into free draw 2 cards, which is very good. And again, do that via a bunch of artifact game pieces, which can do a lot.
Speaking of
honestly, this card seems like Galvanic Relay. It's just Galvanic Relay.
Okay, well, it's funny you mentioned Galvanic Relay because that's the comparison I was going to make to the next card, Follow the Bodies, which is 2 and a blue for a sorcery with Gravestorm. As we all know, that means when you cast a spell, you copy it for each permanent put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, and it says Investigate. So Investigate, you make a clue, which you can sacrifice for no mana. This card feels a lot like Galvanic Relay, where it's going to be pretty easy to make this 4 or 5 in a lot of decks.
See, we first talked about this card on an episode when it was spoiled, and I think I may have overrated it at first. I think my perceptions of this cube, whether I like it or not, are still colored heavily by the early days of drafting this cube, when the list was a little bit different, but more importantly, a lot of people didn't really know what to do here. And I remember in the early days, I was like, I am taking everything that costs no mana. It does not matter what it does. I'm taking anything that costs no mana, and I'm going to put it in my deck because that is such a huge advantage, and I will figure out how to win from there. And I had a lot of success playing that strategy. As time has gone on, I never see things late in packs that cost no mana. People have caught on to the fact that these things are really good, and I think it's actually probably much harder to enable this than it might at first seem. I like this card here. I think it's cool. I'm not worried about being too good. I think it's just a very cool thing you have to work a little bit for, and then has a big payoff. I don't think it's as good as Galvanic Relay. I don't think it's as good as Tamiyo into Story Circle.
I think it's much better than the Story Circle, but I don't know. I think Galvanic Relay is also weirdly underrated. I didn't want to mention this because I was really, really happy to wheel it last night, but I was shocked to wheel that card, and it made my deck.
Yeah, I don't think you should have wheeled it either, but I wasn't in red, so I don't know what to tell you.
Okay.
I couldn't have taken it.
Sometimes that's just how it works.
You don't see how Tamiyo beats the Story Circle is just, the whole thing about Galvanic Relay is it's also slow. You don't get any of those cards this turn. You get them all next turn. Tamiyo meets the Story Circle does the exact same thing, except you just turn every card into 2 cards, where Galvanic Relay turns every card into 1 more card next turn.
But presumably a lot of those cards have also drawn you cards.
You say that, but
how far can we go down this road?
I don't think you can get a lot of, I don't want to overstate how much you can just play a bunch of eggs. They're high picks. You don't get a bunch of them, right? I think I had 4 or 5 cards in my whole deck last night that replaced themselves when I played them.
Okay, will you now be able to potentially get more eggs that we're putting these powerful lands in?
Interesting question. That's, I think, a cool side effect,
actually. Because if there's a pack that has both, and you might be the person
I'm taking the on-color land for sure over the off-color egg. Absolutely.
Ooh, but casting the eggs is fun. They draw cards.
I guess it depends on what my deck is doing. I'm almost certainly taking the on-color land pack 2 than the off-color egg. Half off-color egg? Probably half off-color egg.
I do have 2 concerns about this card, though, that are maybe worth mentioning. Gravestorm is a little bit difficult to track, and it's another thing to track, and so
it doesn't care about being put into the graveyard from your hand.
Yep, that's the second thing.
Which makes that's why it's hard to track. You can't just look at your graveyard and say, here are the things that ended up here this turn.
We actually made this mistake when I think it's called Bitter Reunion was in the cube. The other card that has Gravestorm from Time Spot or Time. What was the time shift?
Future Sight.
Future Sight. Thank you.
It's not Bitter Reunion though. That's a normal card that is a red enchantment that you discard stuff.
Oh, you're right. What is it called?
Bitter Ordeal.
Bitter Ordeal. And I actually misunderstood it for a bit where I was like, oh, well, I'll just cycle all these creatures, and now the Gravestorm count is 8, but it specifically goes from play to your graveyard. So it being another unique thing to track that is slightly difficult to understand. Maybe the reminder text is better here. It says it there. You just have to read it, which is a pain. Who reads their cards?
I watch a lot of Bosch and Roll videos. Specifically, I think I may have mentioned this on the show before. It's one of the most deranged things I do, but oftentimes to fall asleep, I will watch a Bosch and Roll League on YouTube, and I'll watch the deck tech, which is 5 minutes, and I'll watch him describe the deck, and then I'll turn off the screen, and I'll just listen to him talking through the match, and I'll try to follow the board state in my head with whatever comments he's choosing to make, which he's not describing everything that happens, right? He's expecting you're looking at it, so he'll say oh, that's a huge problem, and then, mention cards his opponent are playing, and I try to figure out what's going on. That puts me to sleep right away every time.
That is a bold thing to say. How do you feel if somebody said that they listened to...
Totally fine.
Okay.
I have no problem with that. I also watch I get through a lot of the videos sometimes before I fall asleep. Anyway, more and more there have been things on that channel where Brian's just I can't. These cards are too complicated. And he's a former judge a pro player, a professional streamer who plays Magic all the time. There was a recent video where he was playing a Modern League, and in the second round, his opponent had kind of like an off-meta food combo deck, and he was just like, all the cards said, when you do this thing, do another thing, and they all attached to each other, and he was just like spending so long reading the board state and being like, am I dead if I don't counter this? I genuinely don't know. I hate this. These words are awful. This sucks. And I was like,
these words are awful.
I think he literally said, I hate these words on this card. Just like, I hate that I can't understand what's going on here. I don't know. I just picture that, and I'm like, imagine if you're not Brian Koval and you're trying to follow that board state. You just give up. You just don't. You just play your cards and hope everything's fine.
I don't know, but I assume if you're playing this deck in Modern, does this? No. Oh, no. I don't have to figure this out. Okay, this will be a 3/3 and you scry 1. This will be a 4/4. Or this will be a 3/3. That's 6/7 damage and you scry 1. This is when you create a token. God, these words. I hate these words. Okay, so this will be 7 damage. Then they can crack the food and make it 9 damage. I don't think I need to interact with this. Oh, it also doesn't trigger off itself. And they have 1 card left in hand. Did a lot of work there. Walking Ballista. Why? Okay. When you create a token, put a +1 counter on a creature other than Rosie. Okay, so putting counters on Ballista from Rosie is the combo. Counter and token are different words. I'm just trying really hard not to mess this up in real time. With a bunch of cards I've never read in my life. +1 counter on this. Put a +1 counter on this. So this will now be 7 damage in combat. Plus they ping me with Walking Ballista. And they are hellbent. Okay, hope I didn't miss the combo. This resolves. Unless I've just misread one of these cards in some crucial way after reading them 6 times out loud to all of you. I don't see a way to generate more tokens, which seems to be the missing piece of this engine right now. Anyway,
I think Gravestorm is grokkable. And it helps that what you do with the Gravestorm here is so much, like Bitter Ordeal also has a kind of like search your opponent's library, and like it's just a complicated.
I actually looked at that again, being like, is it time to reconsider this?
No,
this
it's
actually
never
does
time
feel
to
kind of cool,
that,
but then
no.
I'm imagining somebody taking like literally 10 minutes to resolve it at an event and, writing down every card in their opponent's deck because they get... Yeah, lots of challenges there. Again, in like cuts, I'm cutting a cycling creature that you're rarely, if ever, casting an Oblivion Ring, which there are just kind of too many of, and the sorcery speed makes them not that powerful. Boromir is the one white card that's really relevant. I think I'm going to cut Jace the Mind Sculptor. He was kind of here as a fun benchmark to be like, look how bad this card is that's iconically powerful, but I don't know how much that's really necessary, even though I kind of like it.
I think he's still fine, but he's not interesting in this context.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's really there just as a benchmark to like show you how cards are warped differently.
Yeah. Which, to be fair, like, why not also cut Oko in that regard?
Well, because now we still have 1 joke.
Okay.
And people play Oko sometimes.
People play Jace too. The cards are fine. They're just not better because of the restriction.
Right.
And because everything else got so much better, Jace is still like, look at me, I draw another card every turn. And that's still good. Like we said, card advantage is hard to come by here. It is. I'll still put Jace in almost all my blue decks, but it also costs 2 mana, which is twice as much mana as I want to pay for most spells.
Couple colorless cards. Glaring Fleshraker, I think, is going to be quite powerful, but is interestingly a card that actually costs not generic, but colorless mana. It's got the little wing ding in the corner, so it costs 1 colorless, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, create a 0/1 Eldrazi with sacrifice to make a colorless mana, and also whenever a colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, Glaring Fleshraker deals 1 damage to each opponent.
So sick.
So this is another just payoff for cast a bunch of colorless spells, and your opponent will find themselves dead.
I love that this one also can go in a deck that just casts a bunch of colorless spells. It can go in a deck that wants to flood the board with creatures because it has a bunch of creature ETB things that pay it off. It has other sacrifice outlets. It's also just a ramp card if you're in a colorless deck. I think it does a lot of things, and I think the colorless mana is like a thing that you otherwise don't have to think about at all in this entire cube. This is the only card that is going to care about actually being able to produce a colorless mana, which none of the eggs can do, Chromatic Sphere can't do, Guild Globe can't do. None of the like artifacts can do that. So you really have to take a land that can do that in some way, and those aren't fetchable. They're not something you can tutor up with any of your land cycling effects. So you got to work for it.
Yeah, if anything, honestly, I might be worried that there might not be enough lands that produce colorless.
That is the only concern I would have, is that it'd be too hard to do this. Like, it almost makes you want to put Sol Ring back in.
Sol Ring's still here.
Oh, great.
I actually put Sol Ring in my deck yesterday, even though it's usually pretty bad, but I had 2 4-mana artifacts I was trying to cast.
As long as you got Soul Ring in here, then I think Glaring Freshwaker is cool.
Great. Disruptor Flute, we've talked about this, I think, on a previous episode. This is an artifact with flash, enters the battlefield, choose a card name. Spells of the chosen name cost 3 more to cast, and importantly, activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. I think this being like a targeted removal spell at instant speed for very specific things, namely, Aether Flux Reservoir is just like a cool interactive card, and actually lets you interact on turn 0 when your opponent is trying to combo off before you get a turn.
That's the biggest thing, is the turn 0 interaction.
Yeah.
I mentioned this in the cardy in the drive home last night, but my fair deck leaned on turn 1 discard when I was on the play, and when I wasn't on the play, I had both Force of Vigor and Force of Despair in my deck, and I would have loved 1 or 2 other ways to interact on turn 0. Like, Dismember would have been fantastic, this would have been fantastic, just something to say that, like, I'm going to throw a little stick in the spokes of whatever you're trying to do on turn 1 to give me a turn.
Bone Flute. Yeah, I'm glad to hear actually that those cards are performing, because I feel like they've been overlooked at some points in the past.
I love both those cards a lot in this cube.
All right, just to make Allison happy, I'm thinking about throwing in this Bark Form Harvester, which lets you recycle cards into your library. I don't know if that's a good idea.
I don't know if we need this.
I don't know.
I'll say this. I think Transplant Theorist, which was by far the...
I'm glad that costs you 2 mana.
Yeah, well, it was... Allison wielded it last night. Shouldn't have. I think people learned last night the hard way. But also mentioned this was the premier card in their deck. It's probably a card most of you don't know. Transplant Theorist is 3 in a blue, so here just 1 in a blue, for a 2/4 artifact creature Phyrexian Artificer. Whenever it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So just tons of looting, which is also just great here because you end up with extra lands in hand when you're cycling through your whole deck for all the reasons mentioned. And then it has an activated ability which costs 2 mana, which so here is just free. Put target card from your graveyard in the bottom of your library. And, you know, I watched Allison win a game in the finals that she could have won a myriad of ways, but she chose to win basically by saying, like, hello, Artifact Matters opponent. I have drawn my whole deck. I may now put Hurkyl's Recall in the bottom and draw Hurkyl's Recall every single turn for the rest of the game. Would you like to continue playing, or would you like to scoop? And they were like, I have nothing to say about that. My deck is all artifacts. I can't possibly win. This one is the really cool one. Barkform Harvester to me is just like the very uncool Transplant Theorist, and I don't know that you need 2 of this.
It's a squirrel.
It's a everything, but I don't know that you need 2 of this.
Yeah, this is a fair point. I'll think about that some more.
What I would love to see 2 of, or more...
Shieldreds?
Salvage Mana Workers. There are multiple cards
that have...
There
are a lot of those.
There's multiple cards that have the Salvage Mana Worker ability, and that is one of my favorite ways to ramp in this environment, because it is not just broken ramp that you play in every deck the way that, like, the eggs or whatever
are. Oh, it
are.
absolutely is.
I mean, I do play it in every deck, but it's not... It's the fact that it really rewards you for being able to play instants, because you get that mana on both turns of the game. And if you're just getting it on your own turn, then it's, you know, it's a Prophetic Prism that doesn't draw a card, right? Which is good. I'll take a Prophetic Prism. It's just like 5-color Mox, right? Which is good, not great here. I'm not taking it over an egg. I'm not taking it over Prophetic Prism. I'm not taking it over any of that stuff. The being card neutral, like not drawing a card, makes it so much worse than all those other alternatives. But you can make it better if you can use the mana on both turns of the game, and it really encourages mana sinks, and it really encourages instant speed interaction, which I think are things that should be encouraged here.
All right, that's a fair note. I definitely deliberately did not put more than 1 of those just because I'm like, we already got functionally the same card, but that's
and
that's
yet
a good
Barkform Harvester is here staring at me when the much cooler Transplant Theorist is already winning pods.
Again, squirrel. All right, what do you think about Shimmer Mirror? This is 3 mana for a 2/2 with flash, and you may cast artifact spells as though they had flash. Is this actually interesting or relevant aside from the very narrow use Elvish Spirit Guide to cast this on your opponent's turn 1?
I think it'll probably be relevant. I do really wish it cost 2 mana. It would be so much better if it cost 2 mana. Before you say it'd be broken, I don't think it would be.
It would be.
You can't actually, like, it's so hard to actually fill your deck with artifacts. So many people want artifacts in this cube. Like, I don't know how Dave got so many last night, by the way. Dave, your deck was disgusting. It only lost to the incredible competence of Allison. But usually, even when I try, like, your artifact deck is going to have a fair number of non-artifact spells because they're all taken very highly. Like, the artifacts are some of the best cards here for most decks.
I had 14 in my deck, 15 in my deck last night.
I mean, that's still... So you're going to have on average, what, 3 in your opening hand? If one of them is Shimmer Mirror, you get
Sounds
to play
right.
2 cards ahead of time? Like, I don't know. I don't think it's broken. I think it'd be...
Yeah, I don't think it's broken. I think it might just be
saying I don't think it would be broken at 2 mana or 0
Okay.
mana. I would love more ways to do things on turn 0 here, and I have a couple suggestions when we get to the end here that maybe would help with that.
Well, on that bombshell, I think we're kind of at the end. I mean, there's a couple of the little
cards.
swaps, but nothing that's like really going to change things. I wonder if there's any other cuts that are worth mentioning. I cut some of the other basic land cyclers just because they so rarely get cast, and again, it's like you have so few lands, and you often really want them to be fetchable duels, so those cards end up just not mattering as much. They could definitely matter in a different iteration with a very different card list, but here they have not so much.
The only other cut I'll call out is I think Vial of Dragonfire is cool. It's removal it's free removal that is synergistic with what a lot of the decks are doing, casting a lot of spells, sacrificing a lot of stuff. It's not premier, but it's the kind of thing that will get people to put removal in their deck, even if they're not thinking about it, because they're like, free spell, great, I'll put it in my deck, and then they find themselves with removal at a time when it matters, which I think is maybe a nice pattern to encourage.
Right. The reason I put it here is just because I think it's still okay, but it's much worse than it looks.
2 damage doesn't kill a lot of stuff you care about, but it kills a lot of the hate bears.
And it does kill Monastery Mentor.
No, it does not.
Does it not?
I mean, if they can cast any spell in response, it doesn't.
Oh. I don't know. Max,
you should not trust
Max tapped out a bunch of times last night.
I don't think you should trust it to kill a Monastery Mentor. I killed it with 3
bowls of porridge plenty of times.
All right. I have a couple other cards I've suggested in the past that I'm now going to bring up again.
Okay.
So it's on the record. Per the turn 0 interaction, give us a Gemstone Caverns. I'll loan you my Gemstone Caverns. It's not cheap. I'll loan you my Gemstone Caverns from the Degenerate Micro Cube. Give us one of those for this cube.
So this is a card that is really good when it just starts in play.
Yeah. If you're going second, you may exile a card from your hand and start with it and play with a luck counter, and it taps for all 5 colors of mana. Otherwise, it just taps for colorless.
Yeah,
which is great
we had
for
talked
Glaring
about this
Fleshraker.
a couple weeks ago. Let's get one of those in there.
I wouldn't be surprised if you looked at it and were like, "Why is this card $50? That's not worth it."
I don't know what. Yeah,
whatever
why is
it costs. I think it's just never been reprinted basically at all.
They reprinted it in a commander set.
How recently?
And
though?
the list.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know why it's so expensive. I guess it's played in some constructed something. But I have one. You can borrow it.
It is a little bit confusing. It's also funny. I feel like I ended up doing a lot of sideboarding player draw, like just based on whether or not I was going to play draw in this format. It was funny. My opponent didn't really do anything one of the matches, but then I was still like, okay, I know you have a Misty Rainforest. I still want to sideboard just based on the fact that I'm going second now.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely do a lot of sideboarding play versus draw here, which I think is a cool factor of this environment. Like, I take out, for example, my fast bond effects on the draw in my fast bond deck, unless I'm a fully dedicated fast bond deck. Last night, I took out my fast bond and my Wayward Swordtooth, which was my worst second play additional lands card on the draw every time for just more interaction. I just brought in more removal spells, basically.
Yeah, I ended up doing similar things.
So anyway, get one of those in there. I think that's great. I will once again bring up the Memory Jar recommendation.
I'm not sold on the Memory Jar.
You don't think it's good, or you think it's too good?
I don't think it's good, but when it is good, it's going to be really good.
I feel like I've heard both sides from you, is that it's not good enough and also it's too good. I think it's excellent. I think it's worth 3 mana, because it's going to have the 2 mana discount. And to be fair, things that are worth 3 mana here it's a short list. It's not a lot. But my opponent last night just hard cast Valley ran it on turn 1 because they were like, I made a bunch of mana, and that's all I have left to do, so here's a Valley ran it. And I was like, enjoy this Deadly Designs. I'll see you in... Actually, that game ended up being close because they emptied their entire hand and cast Valley ran it. And the only reason this game was close is because 2 of the cards they emptied their hand with were Maze Mine Tome and Sunset Pyramid. And so they drew both those cards that turn, used those cards as well, left the turn with no cards in hand, and then just drew 3 every turn after that because they had those 2 cards.
Pretty cool.
So that kept that game close despite going all in on a Valley ran it and Druid of the Elysian Grove and me getting rid of both of them with Deadly Designs. Anyway.
For that reason, you want Memory Jar.
I think it'd be very cool here, and it's an enabler. It's just going to let the decks do whatever the deck is designed to do. I want it really badly for the discard deck. I think it is a great payoff for all the discard punishers because it allows you to enable them by making your opponent discard a bunch of cards while also letting you draw more of your deck, like sacrificing the Memory Jar to then draw into punishers for discard that then your opponent is going to immediately discard after that, I think is a great line, and I think people do cool things with it. I think it's a cool card to include here. I'm going to also re-up the suggestion of Nadu. What do you know about Nadu? Do you even know the rules text of Nadu off the top of your head? Here's my impression. I think you think Nadu is just broken and everyone hates it, and that is your sort of read on it. But have you really thought about what it does in this cube?
No, and I do think that context is important. I feel like I want to sit down. I want people to sit down and be like, I'm drafting the Turbo Cube. Let's do this. And not like, oh, here's this shadow from this recent...
That's exactly what Oko is. Oko's just the shadow from 4 years ago.
But he sucks.
A Nadu would be
it's
decent here.
Time has passed.
Nadu would be decent here. I actually think, for all you people griping about Nadu, I think there's probably equally as many, if not more players, that are excited to play Cube because they can play their banned cards that they otherwise have affection for. And this just got banned from Commander. It's been banned from other constructed formats, and I think more bans are expected. It's kind of a messed up card. Here, it would be very good, but it would, I don't think, be a premier card. I'm not sure I'm first picking Nadu, but it would be a payoff for things that you otherwise don't have a payoff for, which is very cool. It pays you off for, like, targeting your own creatures with abilities, which you have nothing else in this cube that pays you off for that. It makes a bunch of other cards, like equipment, that otherwise are maybe forgettable.
Like Ring of Vulcus, for example?
It makes Ring of Vulcus so much better. It really, truly does.
It sure does.
I think it's a very cool inclusion.
I feel like it would end up just drawing your whole deck, and I feel like...
It only triggers twice a turn.
Per creature. And you're gonna
how many creatures can you really make?
1 million.
You're not going to be able to do the combo. I mean, unless you actually put Springheart Nantuko in, you're not going to be able to pull off the combo that made this such a problem in Constructed, right? But
I think you might be able to. I mean, especially if you have a bunch of free to cast creatures. It's like, cool, I drew another creature. I'll cast this for free. I'll equip it twice.
Free to cast creatures.
I ended up again with like 8 of them in my deck last night.
You had 8 free to cast creatures, really?
I don't know.
Immediately doubting himself.
4. Okay, 4 is
half of what you
8.
said. So you're likely to have less than 1 in your opening hand with your Nadu.
I don't know. I guess it's like, it's fun to take these cards that turn into turbo cards that used to not be, and Nadu is already a turbo card that does weird, complicated, non-linear stuff, and that's just like not an interesting
this is just the cube that makes every card Nadu, and so Nadu should be here to celebrate
Nadu?
With his homies. I feel less strongly about this one. I just think that the joke of, look, Oko's in here, and Oko doesn't do anything with this turbo restriction is, I think it's played.
It's much
the same way that the Jace joke is played. I think it's, all right, great, we get it. The cube's been around for, 4 years now? Like, it's been around for a long time. It's well established. It's like one of the most followed cubes on Cube Cobra. We get the Oko joke. I think it's time for Nadu.
Do you get the Joko?
I do. I get the Joko. And I think it's time for Nadu to step into that role.
But then you'll be like, oh, isn't it funny that Nadu's here? And I'll be like, oh no, it's still really messed up.
I think it's worse than 6.
Yes, I agree.
And
with
harder
that.
to cast.
Yeah.
I think it's
talking me into cutting 6.
I think it's about as good as Tireless Provisioner, Warren Soul Trader, Ruthless Knave.
It's harder to cast.
Tameo meets the Story Circle.
You know what? It really doesn't spark joy.
And then all argument is immediately quelled.
I've destroyed
I can't
you
possibly
in the arena of cube discussion.
All right, we got to go because we got to go play Magic with Ryan Sachs right now. We have like 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
So this podcast is over. We have surveys out right now for Duskborn. We're combining Duskborn with Bloomburrow, so make sure you get in your responses for the Duskborn survey. And if you have hot takes for either set, you can send them to mail at luckypaper.co or find me on Twitter or on Discord. For those of you that are going to be Madison, we'll see you at CubeCon in just like a month. It's like really close.
It's coming
Less than a month? 3 weeks? I got to make sure I have all my stuff ready.
Tonight. Are your cubes ready?
Cubes are ready, yeah.
Okay.
Single cube, just the
single
one.
Cube.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking I'm going to bring Neoclassical Cube for the bar cube night, maybe, if I feel like dragging 2 cubes around Madison the entire weekend, which I don't know that I do. We'll see. We're going to find out. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you, Anthony, for bringing all of this fun, meaty cube design discussion for us to talk about the Turbo Cube. If we got any of the card text wrong in this episode, that was an intentional bait to get you to leave a comment for engagement, and if you left that comment, you fell for it. All the music on the show is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards and Speaking into Microphones About It. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of cube.
Thank you for indulging me in talking about this very silly cube for all of this time.
I would talk about this cube every other episode. I have so many thoughts.
That'd be a lot.